This evening, we are continuing our Bible study series, our survey, and we're getting further into the life of King David. Now, a tremendous amount of space is spent on the life of King David. That ought to tell us something. It tells us that God places a lot of emphasis on the life and the example of David and the things that David went through. There's more space spent on the life of David than there is of any other one individual in the Scriptures other than Jesus Christ himself. Much of David's life, much of the things that he went through were themselves prophetic of the events of Christ's life. Anybody that needs any of the material for this evening, if you just keep your hands up, I think we've got plenty to pass around. The deacons will see it and they can get it passed around. Now, the section this evening focuses in on David as king. We previously covered earlier parts of David's life. We saw last Bible study, which was actually prior to the feast, that David's life could be divided into four component parts. David the shepherd boy, David the hero, David the outcast, and David the king. Last time we went through the first three of these, which really consisted of the first 30 years of David's life. As a shepherd boy, later as a hero of Israel, as the slayer of Goliath, and then as an outcast from the court of King Saul. Now, this section this evening, which is primarily the book of 2 Samuel, focuses in on David as king. This material provides a background for the future history of Israel, and in reality it provides a background for all of prophecy. And we're going to see why it's so important as far as prophecy is concerned a little bit later. There are lessons here in this section for the individual, in the example of David and of others, and of God's subsequent reaction to that example. We see what people did. Sometimes they did what they should have done. Other times they did what they should not have done. That's kind of like us today. Sometimes we both don't. Well, here we find the example of what actually happened, and then we see the result. Now, as we go through in this section of David as king, we start out with David's lamentation for Saul and Jonathan. We go on to David's rule over Judah from Hebron, and then his capture of Jerusalem and his rule over all of Israel. We find David bringing the ark into Jerusalem. We have the Davidic covenant established. God made a special covenant with David. We're going to focus on that a little bit later. We see the boundaries of David's kingdom were extended out and established. We see David's sin with Bathsheba. Then later Amnon's crime and Absalom's rebellion. David's sin of numbering Israel. Adonijah's rebellion. David's final charge to Solomon. And then his death. So there are a lot of ups and downs that went through. Now, from a prophetic standpoint, 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16 is a very important section of Scripture. Let's notice. 2 Samuel 7, in verse 12. Now, you remember the story that David, once he was established and settled in his own palace, he said, I don't feel right about it that I am dwelling in a fixed dwelling place, and the ark of God abides in a tent. I want to build a temple, one that will be suitable for the great God. And David proposed that, and when it was first mentioned to Nathan the prophet, he thought it sounded like an excellent idea. But then God came to Nathan and said, you go back and tell David that I've got other ideas. Now here's what, because of course David was not allowed to build the temple. But notice what God said here in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 12. Notice God's message to David. When your days be fulfilled, and you shall sleep with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, which shall proceed out of your bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, what we find is that God told David, he said, look, he said, you wanted to build a house for my name. You're not going to build a house for me, but I'll tell you what, I will build one for you. I'm going to establish your house, your dynasty. I'm going to establish your son and a dynasty of kings after him on this throne that I have given you, and your throne shall endure forever. Now notice what he said. He said, if your descendants sin, I will punish them, but I will do so with the rod of men. I will punish them, but I will not punish them the way I did Saul. Now how did God punish Saul? He ended Saul's dynasty. Here was a promise to David that David's dynasty would not be ended the way Saul's was. Did kings of David's dynasty sin? Yes, they did. Did God punish them? Yes, he did. Did he end that dynasty the way he ended Saul's dynasty? No. Now, how did he end Saul's dynasty? Did he wipe out all the descendants of Saul? No. No, you can go through in Chronicles and it's very apparent. Saul had descendants that came all the way down. But those descendants never again sat on the throne. They ceased to sit on the throne. Now, if you go through, and I'm not going to go through all the details that are gone through in Mr. Armstrong's book on the United States and Britain and prophecy, but I would say that if you are not familiar with that material, it might be good to go back and review it and to understand that this is a key prophecy. Because, you see, there's someone sitting on the throne of David. That's what it says here. Your throne, David's throne, is going to be established forever. Now, is Jesus Christ right now sitting on the throne of David? Well, the answer is no. It says in Revelation chapter 3, verse 21, you see, Jesus Christ is right now sitting on the throne of God the Father. Notice what he says in Revelation 3:21. Jesus said, to him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am sat down with my Father in his throne. You see, Christ is right now sharing the throne of the Father in heaven. He is going to return to this earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and at that time he is going to sit on the throne of David. And in the future, converted Christians who are changed to immortality at the resurrection can share that throne. But in the same way that Christ right now is sharing the throne of his Father. Christ is not right now occupying the throne of David. He is right now sharing the throne of his Father in heaven. And the throne of David is not in heaven. The throne of David is established on the earth. Well, I think you know the story and how that the royal line of David did not end with King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, because Jeremiah the prophet was responsible for taking one of the daughters of Zedekiah along with certain other materials, to Ireland, and the daughter of Zedekiah was married to the high king of Ireland, Terah. That's where the term, you've heard the old plantation Terah. Well, that is derived from the name of the ancient capital of Ireland. That was the seat of the high kings of Ireland, Terah. And that's where that line was continued. It goes into detail in the United States of Britain and Popsy. I won't go into that detail now, but that dynasty has continued right on down till today. So the royal family of Britain sits on that throne of David. That's why that the stone that is the coronation stone is identified and recognized to this day. It's in Jacob's pillar. Out of Jacob's pillar, get all the way to him. It's a part of that symbol on which the kings of ancient Judah were coronated. As we go through some of the material of Kings, we will notice several times where specifically the kings were coronated sitting on that rock. And that custom has continued right on down. So this is something that will ultimately culminate in Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who is going to come as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So here is a prophecy concerning the throne of David that it's going to exist on out into eternity. And ultimately it's going to be occupied by Jesus Christ, whose right it is. So this section this material is prophetic, showing the continuation of the throne of David. And verses 14 and 15 are proof that though some of David's descendants could prove themselves unworthy of the throne, God did not bring the dynasty to an end. Now, from a personal standpoint, this section of Scripture, one of the greatest lessons that comes in this material, it concerns the aftermath of David's sin with Bathsheba. And one of the very important lessons that is emphasized as we go through the life of David is the fact that sin hurts. No matter how deeply repented of, sin has physical consequences that can never be removed. So because of David's conduct, because of his example, during the years his children were growing up, he reaped headaches and heartaches by the ton, even though he later repented of his earlier conduct. But you see, when he had learned certain lessons and had come to certain conclusions, there were problems that were already advanced in his family that simply could not be reversed. Now these examples are here for us. God records the mistakes as well as the successes of his servants, because it is important that we be able to take and to learn from some of these things. Now, let's note here in 2 Samuel, let's note some of the material, that this 2 Samuel is, of course, just a continuation of 1 Samuel, picks up the story with the death of Saul, which we had read about in the end of 1 Samuel. And as they had come from the slaughter of the Amalekites, a man came out of the camp from Saul, this is in verse 2, and came there to David and fell down and said, I've come to bring you news of what happened. And so David inquired, and the man told him of what had occurred and of Saul's death. And notice the story that he tells. He says that Saul said that wanted him to come here and extinguish his life. And Saul was wounded and wanted this man to finish him off, a mercy killing of sorts. And so he comes and tells all of this to David. Now, as a parent, when you get the account and when you compare it with the account that is given in Chronicles, that this is an individual who really was coming looking for some kind of reward. Now, in 1 Samuel 31, we find that Saul tried to commit suicide. Gives the account of how when the Philistines were right on him, Saul was wounded from the archers, and David got the news. Now, some have read 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel 1, they said, oh, the Bible contradicts itself. Well, that's not true at all. Number one, 2 Samuel 1 does not say for a fact that this Amalekite killed Saul. It only says that the Amalekite told David that he killed Saul. Now, there's a big difference in it. One way or the other, this fellow figured, see, everybody knew that David and Saul were enemies. Saul had been after David. This fellow undoubtedly figured that David was going to be happy to find that Saul was dead. And he wanted to be first in line to claim credit for it. He wanted to get any reward that David was going to hand out. And he got it. He got it. It was, but you see, he showed up to claim the credit. Now, maybe Saul managed to botch his suicide the way he messed up everything else in his life. Saul never could successfully accomplish anything, so it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that he even managed to mess up his suicide attempt and just wounded himself a little worse. So it is possible that the Amalekite, the 1 Samuel 31 tells the account from the standpoint of what Saul's intent was. The Amalekite may have come along and finished him off, or it may have been that the Amalekite came along and saw Saul dead and simply decided to embellish the account a little bit so that he would be sure and get a reward. Well, as I mentioned, he got a reward because David's response in verse 14 is, how is it that you were not afraid to stretch forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? How is it that you had no fear to stretch forth your hand and slay the Lord's anointed? Who gave you the right to take his life from him? God had set him in that office. And no human being has the right to remove him. God and God alone has the right to remove him. And you should have had more fear than that. David had the individual taken out and executed because on the basis of murdering the king. Because it was apparent from the story that he told that even if the Amalekite didn't do it, he would have if he could have. He was wanting to claim credit for it, so he got the reward that was rightfully his. And then we have the account that David was grieved for the death of Saul and of Jonathan. He led the nation in mourning. David did not rejoice in the death of Saul. David sets an outstanding example of an individual who was loyal. David saw beyond the person to see God. Over and over again, down through the centuries, people have gotten in trouble because they could not see beyond the human being and see God. They didn't see God in the picture. All they saw were people, and so they took matters into their own hands. David sets an outstanding example in that David always saw beyond the person, beyond the human being. He saw God. He saw God's involvement. And that made David an outstanding individual. David was caught up in that, led the mission towards Saul. abuses, and it's going to kill them. Now we find that the men of Judah in 2 Samuel 2 verse 4 came and anointed David king over the house of Judah. This is in Hebron. And they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And in verse 11, the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7.5 years. Now in the meantime, there was an occasion. You see, one of Saul's, we read here of one of Saul's descendants who was this son of Saul, Ishbosheth, was made king over Gilead and over the portions of Israel that, northern Israel, that were free of Philistine and Amalekite domination. The Ishbosheth was made king over this area. But the nation divided. You see, at this point, Judah had separated itself from the rest of Israel. The nation fell apart, and after the death of Saul, the nation had been invaded by the Philistines. The Amalekites had been there. There was all this fighting and strife. And in the aftermath of that, Judah crowned David as king, recognized him as king. Samuel had actually anointed him as king many years earlier. And it was apparent to Judah that David should be king. Abner, who had been a general of Saul, put Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, as king over portions of the rest of northern Israel. Well, things walked on like this for about 7.5 years, and there was warfare between Judah and Israel. We describe some of that here in 2 Samuel 2. And in 2 Samuel 3, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. Well, things continued on along, and finally Abner became very disillusioned with Ishbosheth and his capacity to be king. So what Abner decided he was going to do was come down and to talk with David and to see about transferring his allegiance and the kingdom, uniting the kingdom under David. Apparently, the kingdom was not going to be united under Ishbosheth. And so there was a desire to unite the kingdom. And verse 20 of 2 Samuel 3, Abner came to David to Hebron, 20 men with him, and David made Abner, the men that were with him, a feast. They conversed concerning all these things, and certain arrangements were made. And then when Abner got ready to leave, in verse 27, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak to him quietly, called him aside, and when he got him over there, he stabbed him, murdered him. Now, why would Joab, who was the chief general for Judah and a cousin of King David, why would Joab have dealt so treacherously with Abner? Well, you remember the story back a little earlier that in chapter 2, when there was a battle raging, Abner had killed Joab's younger brother in the battle. And Joab was bound and determined to get revenge. And so here, when Abner came down here under a peace flag, and Joab saw a chance, he called him aside and stabbed him, killed him, to get revenge for his brother. Well, David was very displeased with this. Abner was given a state funeral, and it was something that it points up something of Joab's character. We're going to note some things about Joab later on. Joab was an individual who was very capable. But Joab was a self-willed person. Now, Joab was often right. Joab often was right. But he was a self-willed individual. He was going to do what he wanted to do. Nobody was going to tell him anything. Joab couldn't follow instructions. Joab always had his own idea as to how it ought to be done. And he had this vengeful streak. You see it evidenced right here. And Joab assassinated Abner in 2 Samuel 3:27. Now, coming on down a little bit later in chapter 4, when Saul's son heard that Abner was dead in Hebron, his hands were feeble, and all the Israelites were troubled. And there was a problem here where we find on down in verse 6, where two individuals, two of the servants of Ishbosheth, verse 7, came to his house when he lay on his bed in his bedchamber, and they smote him, and they slew him, and they beheaded him. They came in and murdered the king in his bed, Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And they cut his head off, and they brought the head of Ishbosheth unto David in Hebron. And they said, well, we have avenged you of Saul, your enemy. Boy, did they not know David very well. And David answered, verse 9, or verse 10, he says, when one told me, saying, behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good tidings. Somebody came saying that Saul was dead, and they thought they were really going to get some big reward. I took hold of him and slew him at Ziklag. He thought I would have given him a reward for his tidings. He came in and was bragging about having killed Saul, and thought he should have gotten a reward, and I took him out and had him executed because he murdered the king. Now, how much more, when wicked men have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his own bed, shall I not therefore require his blood at your hand? See, you are men that king trusted. And you went in there while he was asleep in bed and you murdered him? You think that I am going to be pleased with that? So he had him taken out and executed for murder. David was not given to this kind of intrigue and assassination and treachery. David was not a treacherous individual. Well, as we come on down in chapter 5, all of the tribes came together. You see in the aftermath of Ishbosheth's murder, all the tribes came together and they invited David. They said, look, we would like for you to be king over the whole nation. And David was anointed king over all Israel. He was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 7.5 years in Hebron, so he was 37.5, almost 38, when he became king over all of Israel. Now, it was decided at this time that they would select a new capital. The city of Jerusalem had been a Jebusite stronghold and had not been subdued by the Israelites. So it was decided they would go up there to the stronghold of Zion, which is the mount on which the king's palace is located. It became known as the city of David. It was that portion of the old city. And they were going to go in. They were going to come in and conquer the city. So we have the account here in chapter 5 of going up and going in here to Jerusalem. And David made a promise, verse 8. He said, whoever gets up to the gutter and smites the Jebusite, he's going to be the chief and the captain. So, now what was meant by the gutter, the only water supply for the old city, for the city of Zion, was what was known as the Virgin Sea. This gutter was a 35-foot shaft which came down and hit the water. This is the means by which the city was able to, the fortress, the fortified part, was able to get water. This is a shaft. And the story, if you go through and you put your account through with the First Chronicles, the Joab came up with his plan by which he sneaked into the water supply system. So he came up through the water supply system, climbed up through this 35-foot shaft, and climbed into the city by himself, you see, and killed the guards and opened the gates and let the troops in, because the Jebusite city was fortified. He said, you never get in here. Joab came up with the plan, and he did it. He was a very powerful, a very courageous individual, and became king over all of not king, but over all the city. Well, David came to dwell in the city, in the fortress, in verse 9, Samuel 5, and they called it the city of David. And it began to be built and embellished, and the palace was built, and was made the capital of the nation. And in chapter 6, he decided to bring the ark of the covenant, to Jerusalem. And we had the account that is given here, chapter 6, that they see that they arose, and verse 3, they took the altar of God, bought a new Chron, and they brought it, and they started bringing it into Jerusalem. And they do this great celebration with all the instruments and all the other things that were going on. Well, when they got to Nachon's threshing floor, the ark began to rattle on the house. This was going by fire. And Uzziah took forth his hand and steadied it to grab it. Reached out and touched the ark. And when he did, he was smitten, dead, died there. And they said, now what is this all about? Everybody was upset. David was upset. Notice here the whole information to begin with. When they got ready to bring in the ark, nobody went back and inquired as to how did God say the ark was to be transported. The ark hadn't been transported for many years. It had been at a fixed location. How did God give instructions for it to be transported? Well, it was to be transported not on a cart, but in two poles, or on two poles. It was to be carried on the shoulders of the Levites. They were absolutely forbidden to touch it in the law. It symbolized the very presence of God. It was to be treated with great sacred reverence, because it was a symbol of God's presence. It symbolized the very throne of God, and there was very specific regulations as to how it was to be moved and how it was to be treated. All of those are God. It was like they came up with another idea. Now, God, many times, gives examples in the Scripture. He shows us his reaction and his response. You know, how many times do people come up with something that they think God ought to be pleased with, God ought to be satisfied? You know, God does not want to be worshipped the way that people figure out. It's not that we're to kind of come up with our own ideas and God just has to be satisfied. God instructs us as to how he chooses to be worshipped. And God does not find acceptable
a human substitute. Now, here was a lesson that was very deeply impressed on everyone. Everyone present at that time, it was written down to be impressed on us. Uzzah was smitten by God because he touched the hill, which is especially forbidden by the law. The real problem got back that the leaders used human reason to determine the manner of bringing in the ark to give things exactly God's command. And when human reason comes into play, and people do things their own way, and they don't follow God's instructions, there's going to be trouble and justice. There's going to be problems and complications. When people start intruding on God, he's got problems. There's action there. If God tells us to do something, he wants us to do it the way he says do it. Well, as we continue on down here through chapter 7, let's notice here in terms of the question, I'll give one reference now here in Chronicles where most of 1 Chronicles 11 through 20 is simply a parallel account. But it describes the same type of information as you come on down through 1 Chronicles. But in 1 Chronicles 15, it mentions a little bit of detail that is not mentioned out there. And that is the fact that Hiram, king of Tyre, was the source of many of the materials and the craftsmen that David acquired to build a palace in Jerusalem. And it describes that in 1 Chronicles chapter 13. That the material and the craftsmen to build a palace came from Hiram, king of Tyre. Here now the nation of Israel began to prosper, do some of the outward trappings of wealth, of permanence, of stability. As the nation began to build up, David began to expand out his kingdom, his empire. 2 Samuel chapter 7, that after David had built his house, that he desired to build a temple, a house to God. It's described in 2 Samuel 7, the first 3 verses, that David wanted to build a temple for God. Now, God did not choose to let David be the one to build that. But nevertheless, God responded. God appreciated David's desire. He appreciated David's attitude. It was simply not in God's plan for him to do that. But God responded to David's desire, and he told him that he, God, would establish the throne of David's kingdom forever. We went through that right at the beginning. So that God was going to establish that dynasty. Now, we continue on in chapter 8, that David, verse 1, David smote the Philistines, subdued them. Verse 2, he smote Moab, and mentioned various others. In verse 3, that he smote the king of Zobah as he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates. And he fought against the Syrians. And verse 6, David put garrisons in Syria and in Damascus. The Syrians became servants to David, and the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. And we find the description of some of these things and the way that David's kingdom spread out. In 15, David reigned over all Israel, and he executed judgment and justice unto all the people. So David's borders spread out greatly, stretched all the way to the Euphrates River, and dominated that Middle Eastern area, conquering this area and establishing the nation of Israel in secure boundaries with God's blessing. Now, how did David show his loyalty to the memory of Jonathan? Well, we notice in chapter 9 that David began to inquire as to whether or not there were any of Saul's family that were left. After Ishmael had been killed and there had been all these problems, and he was told that yes, there was one that he sent for one of the elderly servants from Saul's family, and he found that there was a son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, a young man that was lame in his feet. He had a foot injury, and then they had been dropped, and his feet had been broken as a baby, and it never properly healed, so he was crippled, and described here in the account. And David's desire was to show kindness to Jonathan's sake. David was a loyal friend, and he desired to show kindness even to the descendants of Jonathan. So Mephibosheth was invited to Jerusalem and was given special privilege too. Well, in chapter 10, we have an account that shows what happens when somebody can hastily jump to the wrong conclusion. The king of the Ammonites died, and David decided that he wanted to show respect, and he sent ambassadors there. Well, these young upstarts that had become king, he decided that maybe these were spies instead of ambassadors, and he was going to really teach somebody a lesson. He was going to humiliate them. And so he did. And David understood, you see, that when you humiliate the ambassadors or the representatives of a nation, that is an insult not simply to them as an individual, it is an insult to the nation. And so he responded by sending in the army there to the Ammonites, and sending in to Ammon, and the matter was very quickly resolved. So we find that verse 18, the Syrians fled before David, and the Syrians were going to gang up and help the Ammonites. David went in to teach the Ammonites a lesson. The Syrians decided that they were the allies of the Ammonites, and then David decided to teach the Syrians a lesson too. So they all had a little bit of a lesson, and decided that respect was to be shown. And this was, of course, the matter that many of these people, the only thing that they responded to, the only thing that they paid any attention to, was they respected whoever was in charge. They had a respect for authority that was executed, and David did that and strengthened the kingdom. Now, in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, we come to one of the most critical junctures in David's life, to an account of the most serious mistake that he made, or the beginning of the most serious mistake that he made. Because we have the account of David's sin with Bathsheba, and it describes the account of how David saw her and desired her, and they committed adultery, and then later, of course, it became apparent that she was pregnant, and then David was really in a quandary, because now he was going to get found out, because her husband, Uriah, was one of David's generals and was away in battle. There was a war going on. And it's going to be very obvious that Uriah's wife was expecting a child, and Uriah hadn't been around for months. So that was going to kind of let the cat out of the bag. And David decided that the thing to do was to have a cover-up, to try and obscure what had happened. So he would send to Uriah to come back to Jerusalem to bring a report from the battle. And he would get Uriah back there, and then after Uriah had spent a few days at home and had returned to the battle, that he really covered up the fact that Bathsheba had been involved in an adulterous affair because it was in the disguise of Uriah. Well, and so often is the case when people begin trying to stop some kind of cover-up, what happens is that it doesn't do it. With my wife, while all my troops are out there on the front, sleeping there on the ground, no sir, I'm gonna camp out right here, right outside the palace. No, Uriah, you don't have to do that. Really, I appreciate your attitude. Why don't you go on home? Get a good night's sleep. No, sir, absolutely not. No way. Well, David even tried to get him drunk. He said, he'd get the guy to the south, that he would take him home and dump him there, and he wouldn't know what was going on. And even then, it didn't work. And David was beginning to get desperate. And so he got scared, and he decided that he began to connive, and he decided the only thing to do was to bring this thing to a head. So he wrote a letter to Joab, in which he instructed Joab actually to bring about the death of Uriah, because he said, look, I want you to send them right up there in the hottest part of battle, and then you draw the troops back and leave him there, and let's see what happens. And of course, what happened was that Uriah was killed. And the result of this was that when Uriah died, then the idea was the king would just as quickly as he could marry the widow, and they would succeed in a cover-up. Well, we're looking at something that went on here over a period of, by the time all this is over with, and Nathan comes on the scene here in 2 Samuel 12, just about the time of the birth of the child. We're looking at something that's been going on for months. Now, we're given some real insight here in 2 Samuel 11, or in 2 Samuel 12, because Nathan came in, he was a prophet, and he came in to David, and you remember the story of how he went through and he gave him this story. He gave a story of two men in this transaction, and how one had taken advantage of the other. And he asked the king, he said, what do you think ought to be done about this? And the king was absolutely indignant that anybody would do such a thing. And then Nathan looked at him, and he said, you, O king, are that man. Well, I bet you could have heard a pin drop in there, Everybody couldn't believe that they were talking, that Nathan was talking to the king that way. You better realize, this was the Watergate of ancient Israel. They had been, they had been gossiping about this, and all the servants had been whispering about this throughout the palace for months. Things were going about. You know that there was all kind of scuttlebutt that was going all over the place, and people were whispering about it and surmising and guessing and rumors and accusations and all of the kind of thing that goes on something like this, but nobody would have said anything to the king straight on. Nathan did. And when Nathan really unloaded on him, verse 13, David's response. He said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the king. Now, as you go on through the account here in 2 Samuel 12, we see David as he fasted and really sought God, fasted for a week, as he described. And if you go back to Psalm 51, let's just turn there briefly. Notice the heading on Psalm 51. It says, to the chief musician, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came unto him after he had gone in to Bathsheba. So this is the this is the setting of Psalm 51. It's David's psalm of repentance. He said, have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. I acknowledge my transgressions. My sin is ever before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. That you might be justified when you speak and be clear when you judge. I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Purge me with hyssop, verse 7. Wash me. Make me to hear joy and gladness. Verse 9. Hide your face from my sins. Blot out my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Notice all the way down is David's whole response, no attitude. Notice how many excuses did David make? How many excuses did David make? You remember it's important to note the contrast. You note the contrast between David's response to Nathan's correction and Saul's response to Samuel's correction. You remember any time that Samuel ever corrected Saul, Saul always had an excuse? He always had an excuse as to why it wasn't his fault. It was somebody else's fault. Somebody else made him do it. Remember when he had been sent out to destroy the Amalekites and wipe out all the property, and he told he was not to keep any of the booty for himself? And so Samuel comes up there, and what is he? First thing he did, all this, the lowing of oxen and all these sheep and goats and all this stuff. And he comes up there to Saul and says, well, what have you done? He said, I did what God said. He said, what do you mean you did what God said? What are all these animals around here? Oh, well, the people, they wanted to keep back some of them. They were going to keep them back to sacrifice to God. Saul had an excuse. He always had an excuse when he was confronted. David did not offer a single excuse. He didn't say, well, why are you just picking on me? I mean, why don't you say something to Bathsheba? She shouldn't have been taking that bath out there. Or Uriah was a jerk or whatever. He had no excuse, no blame for anyone else. He did not try to minimize his sin. He did not try to justify himself. He took responsibility. He accepted responsibility. And he went to God. And it's very important that we understand that attitude, you see, that is exemplified here. Well, Nathan told them that in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 10, that there were going to be consequences, that the sword would never depart from his house. He was going to have problems. There were going to be family problems because of what he had done. There were consequences set in motion. Yes, God forgave him. But the baby still died. There was a child that was conceived in this evening. God did not heal the child. He allowed the child to go ahead and die. And David had to learn a lesson. There was a lot of pain, a lot of grief. And there were long-term consequences. Later on, David and Bathsheba had another son whose name was Solomon. And God loved Solomon, and he set Solomon as king, and you read that account. Well, as we come on down, we begin to see now some of the problems that came from this mixed up family situation that David had. Because this had always been a problem and a weakness to David. And it proved to bring bitter results home in his later years. You see, he had this, by the time now the kids were getting on up, pretty well grown. He had a number of children,
by a variety of different women. And that produced problems, as it always does, circumstances like this. And so here was a situation where there were various half-brothers and sisters all living together there. And Amnon desired, was lusting after the Tamar, who was his half-sister. And he became so infatuated with her that he was going to come up with some way to try and get her. And finally, of course, it didn't work out that way. And he forced himself and raped Tamar. And you read the account here in 2 Samuel 13. Well, it was a horrible thing. And when Absalom, who was Tamar's brother, heard about it, he was furious and was ready to kill Amnon. And that, of course, is what happened. And that Absalom nursed a grudge until he got a chance, and he murdered his half-brother, Amnon. And then he had to flee for his life. And verse 37 of 2 Samuel 13, Absalom fled. And we're told David mourned for his son every day. And Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and he was there 3 years. So David now mourned over the loss of two sons. Absalom had left. He missed Absalom. Amnon was dead. A terrible, tragic event. The consequences, really, it was a matter that at this stage in his life, the problems from early family days were now, the chickens were coming home to roost. David had been too preoccupied with too many other things early in his life to give his children the attention and the example that they needed. He had been involved with all these different women. He had all these different kids by a variety of different women. It was a confused setup. And there were serious consequences. And things began to unravel. And he was deeply grieved and bothered and upset by it. And David yet had learned many lessons and come to a very deep repentance out of all this. And Psalm 51, after the sin with Bathsheba came to a head. But the problem is that even though you may repent, there can be physical consequences that simply take their toll. And this is what occurred here. Now, Joab perceived the situation and recognized that David would like to make some kind of reconciliation. And so he worked a deal to get Absalom back. Well, Absalom came back, and now he'd been nursing a grudge against his father. Chapter 15, Absalom prepared horses and chariots and 50 men to run before him. Absalom began to work the crowd. He was a real politician. And boy, he was out campaigning. He was early on. And he'd go around, he'd talk to people, and he'd say, "Oh boy, you're out here real early. What are you trying to where are you from? What are you here for?" And they tell him, and they had a case they were trying to bring before the king. He said, "Boy, it's real pity. The king doesn't have somebody to listen to your case. Boy, I wish I were in charge. If I were, I would see that your case is tended to." And verse 5. Notice the way it was. He was going to be the champion of the common man. He was when any man came near to him to do obeisance to him, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. In other words, and on this manner did Absalom to all the Israel who came to the king for judgment. In other words, when somebody came to Absalom, or when they
they recognized him, when they came up to him, they were going to bow down. Absalom would grab him by the head. No, you're not going to bow down to me. He'd embrace him like an equal. And he just had this way about him, this kind of charming way. And he's going to try and ingratiate himself to the people. He's going to be a real man of the people. He was campaigning. And so the account that we go through is, of course, that Absalom was really caught in revolution and was determined to overthrow his father. And when he got the opportunity, he attempted to do so. David just did not have the heart to fight against his own self. David recognized by this time that all these things were coming about. David felt responsible. He felt guilty. He felt he knew that in many cases it was the consequences of his own sin years earlier that were not coming home to it. And he felt like in many ways he had brought it on himself. And the mistakes he had made many years earlier. And he was not going to fight against his son and try to overthrow it. And that he was going to put it in God's hands. He gathered up what he could and he was following those that were faced with him. He left, and he did not want the city of Jerusalem to be deceived. Go through this in 2 Samuel 15. And David was really listening to God in this situation. He God asked him to really go through and to really this is a lot of stuff there. There's a number of years we're looking at. This is like a 5-year period. Iraq from let's say the race of Tamar. There were 2 years until the death of Amnon, and then 3 years Absalom was in exile, and then he came back. And so we're looking at several years downwind. And there were all these problems. Now this attempt at a coup. And the insults and various things that were given to David, and David just didn't have the heart to retaliate on those things. So, verse 15 of 2 Samuel 16, Absalom and the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and so we have this account continuing on, chapter 17, giving more of the details of what Absalom was doing. And it was not God's purpose that David be permanently driven out and overthrown in this way. So he was going to God was going to take care of him. But he allowed this situation to go on for probably a period of months. Is what we're describing here in 2 Samuel 17, is that David was having to flee. There were provisions that were brought. You might notice some of the provisions here in the end of chapter 17 of 2 Samuel. And then in verse 28, they brought beds and basins and earthen vessels, and wheat and barley and flour and parched corn and beans and lentils, parched pulse and honey and butter and sheep and cheese. And so a wide variety of things, a good balanced diet, all the things that were necessary. David and those who were with him were hungry, and they were weary and thirsty in the wilderness. And David organized his men, and here we're looking again. Months had gone by. David organized his men and numbered the people that were with him. Chapter 18, verse 1, he set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them, and he sent forth a third part of the people under the hand of Joab, and a third part under the hand of Abishai, Joab's brother, and a third part under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said, I'm going to go forth with you myself also. But the people said, no, we don't want you to come out to battle, for, we we don't want to take a chance on you being killed. So the king let people go out, and he commanded, notice verse 5, chapter 18, the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. Everybody heard. The king gave specific instructions, be gentle with him. I don't want him hurt. Well, you again know the story that Absalom got tangled up here with the scribes. He got tangled up in a thicket, and Joab found out that where Absalom was, and Joab came up there and killed him. He finished him off while he was there, and he completely disregarded David's instructions. You see, as far as Joab was concerned, he said the guy needs to be killed. Well, maybe he did, but the problem was Joab was not one to follow instructions. Joab was going to do it Joab's way. And he looked at it and he said, David's too fast on it. It's a reprobate. He ought to be finished off. And if nobody else will do it, I'll do it. Which is, of course, what he did. If you want to get an idea, the kind of character Absalom was, notice back in 2 Samuel 14. Verse 25, all Israel, there was none so much praise as Absalom for his beauty. He was he really thought he was something. He was filled with a lot of vanity. Verse 26, he polled his head. Every year's end that he polled. In other words, cut his hair once a year, whether it needed it or not. And it's described here how much it was that he cut off. He had a very thick, heavy head of hair, and he would cut it once a year. And of course, his long hair got him in trouble because in 2 Kings 18:9, when he met the servant David, he was riding on a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between heaven and the earth. And the mule that was under him went away. So he was left hanging there, got all tangled up in all this thickness, you see, when he went through there. And Joab came along and killed him. And so we see the account here in 2 Kings 18. Well, there was word came to David, and David mourned for Absalom and carried on about it. And Joab was pretty disgusted with it all. He figured, look, this punk has torn the kingdom up. He has, been the cause of all kinds of problems. There are a lot of people that have lost their lives. The whole nation has been disrupted. He's nothing but a punk, and he got what he deserved. You're just, all of us have put our life on the line for you, and you don't appreciate it. The only thing you're thinking about is that son of yours. This is 2 Samuel 19, see, verses 4 and 5, where the king was mourning for Absalom, and Joab came, and he says, you have changed this day the face of all your servants, which this day have saved your life and the life of your sons and your daughters and the life of your wives and your concubines. You're not worried about us, and we all put our life on the line. So you get a little bit of kind of the contrast here between Joab and David. And so we note here, I want to focus a little bit on, in the remaining few minutes, on the contrast between David and Absalom. Let's look a little bit at the strengths and weaknesses of David. David evidenced many positive characteristics. I think outstanding characteristics were faith, loyalty, zeal, and wholeheartedness.
David was a man of faith. He trusted God. He trusted God to fulfill his promise from way back, when he was anointed king, and Saul was still king, and to all intents and purposes, how is David ever going to be king? David trusted God. He put it in God's hands. He exhibited great loyalty. He was extremely loyal to Saul and to those who were over him in terms of God's government. He was loyal to his friends. He was loyal to the memory of Jonathan. He was a very loyal individual. He had a tremendous amount of zeal and wholeheartedness. Whatever he did it all the way. Now, David also had some problems. That zeal and that wholeheartedness. David was a very emotional individual. And there were times that too many times that he allowed his emotions to rule his logic, and it got him into some serious problems, primarily in terms of some of his problems with women. Some of his primary failings were as a family man. He had a weakness in this regard. He was not consistent in the rearing of his children, as far as giving them the discipline that they needed. So many times when a person is bogged down and is doing other things and maybe feels guilty about some of their own actions, they try to compensate to their kids by giving them everything. Now, David made some serious mistakes, and he reaped some penalties on some of this. David was an emotional individual who felt things very deeply. God used that characteristic, used him to write the book of Psalms, to mirror there the whole gamut of feelings, of emotions, of ups, of downs, of all of the different things that human beings can feel. David expressed, he verbalized, he went through it, he expresses those things in the Psalms. But David learned lessons. David was an individual who was able to take correction. He was able to learn. David did not make excuses for himself. But David's earlier mistakes had consequences that haunted him through the latter years of his life. Some of that emotionalism, that inconsistency, the things he had entangled himself in with many of these different women, and his lack of attention to his family in the early years produced problems that haunted him later, even when he learned some lessons. But you see, that's why it's important that we learn lessons early. That's one of the reasons God records this for us. What does Paul tell us in the New Testament? These things are written down as examples for us, so that we can see and understand where certain things lead. Because there are consequences that come that no matter how deeply you repent, they're physical consequences. David experienced that in his own family. Now, Joab was an individual that certainly had great courage and personal bravery. But Joab had a treacherous streak. Perhaps his greatest failing was his inability to carry out orders properly. He was stubborn, and he insisted on doing things his own way. See, Joab looked at things. Joab was not, there were certain things that he had in common with David. There was a bravery and a courage that he possessed, that David possessed as well. Joab was the kind of individual that tended to look at it in a more cold, logical, analytical way. He was not, he looked at things and in his way, and he was self-willed. He was convinced that he was right. He figured it out and had it decided as to what ought to be done, and he was willing to do it. And, of course, that trait finally led to his undoing, because he was unwilling to follow the king's instructions on Absalom. It could be argued that David was too soft with his kids for his own good, which certainly was the case. I think that can be demonstrated. But it was not Joab's responsibility to just decide what ought to be done and just go and do it anyway. There are things we can learn from both David and Joab. Recognizing that we just take things in our own hands, we're going to solve it our own way, disregarding the instructions of those who are over us. That's not right. It's not going to come about. It's not going to produce good results. David was an individual that God appreciated in a very special way. And I think one of the most outstanding things about David was the fact that David would accept correction and would grow by it. David was able to really accept the responsibility and to learn lessons. David was not a person who went through making excuses and blaming his problems on someone else. Saul always, everything that happened to Saul was always somebody else's fault. He goes through, there's total contrast. There's a great deal that we can learn as we go through some of this material. If I can get some help on passing out the questions for next time. That there are a lot of lessons we can learn as we go through this material. Yes, it gives us a little bit of historical background as far as the Old Testament is concerned, but realizing that as we get an overview of the history of the Old Testament and the characters who played leading roles, that one of the main reasons God has preserved this information for us is that we might take and learn lessons from it. There are things for us to learn. And as we go through and as we look at the strengths and the weaknesses, the successes and the failures of these men and women whom God worked through, whom God used, we are able to grow and to profit by it. So, next Bible study we will conclude the story of David's death, and the account of Solomon, which will set the story to go forward with the story of Judah and Israel. And we will track down in the course of the next few Bible studies on through the concluding history of Judah and Israel, and perhaps get a little bit of an overview in the course of the next, I guess, about five lessons.